Good afternoon. This is your host, Guillermo Sabatier on Perspective on Energy, and welcome to today's show. I'm the Director of International Services for HSI, and today we'll be talking about small modular reactors and deployment in energy cooperatives. Just wanted to update everyone on some of the latest developments on small modular reactors, and also the micro modular reactors, which is they seems to be gaining traction, at least in Alaska. That was following up on some of the reports and some of the feasibility studies that are happening at this time for a couple of cooperatives that are in Alaska, just maybe 50 miles north of Anchorage. And if you do a search, you'll find most of the information on one of those podcasts anyway. But what drew my attention, namely, was the fact that now they're already engaging in feasibility studies to see if they could actually, within the next 4 or 5 years, actually break ground and perhaps get one of those units up there and running. Now, mind you, those regions in Alaska are pretty much isolated and on their own. They're not connected to WEC or the Eastern Interconnection or even the Canadian grids, right? So they're definitely isolated. So for them being so remote and being so isolated, I guess electrically dependent, right, kind of like proves to be an interesting opportunity really for this sort of technology. Now, granted, these utilities, or these co-ops, right, up there, they have quite a bit of hydroelectric energy during the summers. And I guess the kilowatt hour for the residential rate runs at about 14 to 18 cents. But in the winter, all of that freezes up, and they end up at close to about 40-something cents a kilowatt hour. So for them, that's the winter. So they get to enjoy savings in the summer, but the winter gets pretty expensive. So one of the things that they, of course, being a cooperative, right, they usually have to get the members and the board on board before they do anything like that. So one of the things that they were discussing was the fact that is the initial impressions, right, of nuclear. And one of the things that the nuclear industry has struggled with in the last, I guess, a few decades, the fact that it's concerns on a safety record, right, concerns on the risk that it poses to the public or even the environment. Right? And one thing that's interesting to point out is the fact that we really haven't built any new nuclear reactors from nuclear plants in large scale, other than that large unit in Vogel in Georgia. So really, it's been a really difficult 20 or 30 years in the sense that for the point of innovation and development. Right? Now you're looking at all these new types of technologies. Basically, the conventional type of device we've known has been what they call a Type 2. Now you're looking at Type 3, are these SMRs, and then Type 4s are these advanced fission reactors, where they're sort of reusing all of that energy, all of that spent fuel. So one thing that I thought was interesting was the fact that they had a pretty effective education campaign when it comes to understanding what the technology actually is, right? And then what the current state of it is, where you have a lot of passive systems that would actually come to a point of rest should anything happen, rather than all of these active circulatory reactor coolant pumps, feed water pumps, all these things that wouldn't be used in a small or a micro modular reactor. So in this case, from the perspective of an accident, right, really a lot of that will come to rest inherently. So by itself, the design seems to be a lot safer, also a lot smaller. Now, at the same time, right, there's always concerns, right, when they think about nuclear energy, whether it's something like Fukushima or maybe 3 Mile Island or even something like Chernobyl, right? It's a completely different technology. So in this case, right, they're able to actually implement that and have it to the point that it's really, really safe compared to everything else. Currently, right now, there's a couple of companies that are doing it. They're already engaging in that sort of design and proof of concept. So one of them, this co-op in Alaska, I think, has reached out to New Scale Power, and they're the ones running that feasibility study up there. So rather than keeping it a secret and everything else, they kind of got the public involved, and then a co-op, pretty much everybody's a member. So they got rid of what's happening. So pretty much on board, right? So we're seeing quite a fast development of this in that place. So before you know it, we may see that first commercial deployment and going full commercial in that part of the country. So the interesting thing here is that they were, again, like the public had its concerns, right, when it comes to the safety and dealing with all the other problems and challenges associated with nuclear. But at the same time, right, given that may have been 20, 30 years ago, now the fact is that they're looking at the potential of maybe this being the bridge between fossil fuels and having a carbon-free future, right? And at the same time, having a resource that's fully dispatchable. And that's one of the challenges that we see with renewables, right? Is you just simply cannot have enough batteries to be able to account for all the variability of all these renewable sources. It'd be great. I mean, it's just wonderful to add them to the fleet and have them as a mixed portfolio. But again, it's having diversity in that portfolio is what really gives you a lot of reliability and safeguards you from any kind of like emergencies, uncertainty, or even like a adverse weather, or even in some cases fuel shortages. In other cases, for example, having a problem with general availability or even supply chain. So that's one of the things that I think they're looking at as well. But from my perspective, I think one of the more important aspects of this is the fact that it's definitely zero emissions, right? True zero emissions, and also from the point of compared to the existing technology of, like, for example, that Gen 2 they call it, or Type 2, that this is like a Type 3 and Type 4, where you have some of the more advanced reactors already being developed. Now, mind you, there is something already on the ground functioning and running, and that's of course in China. So we're definitely behind when it comes to that deployment. They're a little bit ahead of us, but I don't think it'll be for much longer, given the fact that we're now funding this. The Department of Energy is funding a lot of this as well, and now the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is also reviewing this technology for deployment. One of the things that the guests at NewScale were discussing is the fact that just having the NRC review a new technology, right, and not even approve it, just reviewing it, it runs about $500 million, and that's that's quite an initial upfront cost when you're trying to get your new tech approved to be able to use it when it comes to a nuclear energy source. So that in itself is typically a barrier, but it seems that they managed to secure funding for that, and they're moving forward. So it's not just NewScale; it's quite a lot of other companies: Rolls-Royce, General Electric, Westinghouse, and Areva, of course, which is French, and then some of the couple of Korean companies, of course, they've had great success already with conventional nuclear reactors, both in the UAE. And then it looks like they may be the one building it in Saudi Arabia, identical reactors. So they are the ones now also getting into the whole SMR and even the micro modular reactor game. And apparently this is something that we may see throughout the rest of the world, right? So especially when you're dealing with isolated communities. So let's discuss what the differences are with some of these reactors, right? So you got Gen 1 and Gen 2 is some of the more conventional large-scale nuclear fleet that we see now, right? Whether here and in Europe, whether it's a pressurized water reactor, or you have something that has like a heat exchanger where you have a containment building separate from the rest of the loop, and then you have the heat exchanger where you have the secondary steam loop going through a turbine, which of course completely separate from the actual hot material, right? So that's like a Gen 2 or a Type 2. Now these Type 3 or Gen 3s, right? Most of these MMRs and SMRs fall into a Type 3 sort of design, where they have a lot of like passive systems, whether it's molten salt or some other implementation that makes it a lot safer. Mind you, it's perhaps not as efficient as these other systems, but they're far more advanced and even a lot more reliable, right? Naturally, one of the key aspects of this is that they're a lot smaller. Some of them SMRs can be anywhere from 50 to 200 megawatts. These micro reactors, they're going to be anywhere from like 5 to like 20 or 30, right? So there's different gaps and sizes in between, but definitely something that shows promise, right? Now, there's I mean, you don't want to detract this from other research, right? Naturally, when hydrogen, for example, is something that has everybody excited, including myself, and this is definitely something worth pursuing. But at the same time, right, it's that looks like it's quite a ways away from being actually like feasible and commercial, right? So with the nuclears, right, it's something that can get us there in the next 5, 10, 20 years until the next source, the next innovation is ready. So hopefully, having this kind of innovation, this kind of diversity is something that can play a huge role in getting us to this zero emissions, zero carbon emissions type of energy generation, and but at the same time be reliable, and then also help us secure our energy future. In the past, I've spoken about the importance of treating energy as a national security topic rather than a commodity. And that becomes even more important when the rest of the world is actually getting leaps and bounds ahead of us because they are weaponizing our environmental policy against us. So definitely, it's important to meet those climate goals, but we should do it, with a careful pace and with a lot of caution, right? It's better than lunging forward at all and any cost. Whereas now you end up making it almost unaffordable for developing countries to be able to even implement some of these clean energy goals, right? So with these SMRs, right, there's definitely that hope in that gap. So what does this do, right, when it comes to a feasibility study in an area, right? They're trying to implement the ideal location, ideal setup, ideal size, and naturally, it's there's going to be a lot of resistance. Where it's like they're going to have the typical "not in my backyard" attitude, right? But the problem is, though, there are times that it has to be in a certain place, right, geographically and even geologically. So along with that, though, it's far smaller compared to a larger nuclear site. Right now, I'm not quite sure what size they're planning on building this. It could have been 50 megawatts. It could be 200 megawatts. Right. Still, it's a lot smaller compared to like a conventional nuclear facility. Right. Now, this utility is about the size of Maryland. So I mean, they're like by 100 by 200 miles. So they're not that large. So I imagine it might be somewhere between 100 150 megawatts to actually implement and serve their load. But one of the things that I find interesting is that it's isolated enough from the rest of the country that it's most of us will want to look and see, while at the same time not getting that sort of pushback that you might get if you're doing something in the mainland in the continental U.S. Right. So implementing in Alaska, you might see a lot more favorable environments actually having this deployed. Not to mention the fact that it's also way smaller than anything else you would implement. So along with that, one of the things that I think, and feel free to leave some comments below. I'm going to try to get to them and hopefully answer them. But it's definitely a concerning thing, right? When you think about nuclear accidents or even more importantly, nuclear security, right? Somebody trying to break in and steal or sabotage one of these facilities and maybe cause some kind of widespread contamination, right? So that's something that is I still would like to see answered when it comes to maintaining these small facilities secure, right? So mind you, it's not going to be the same type of large facility that has several layers of defense and protection. These are going to be smaller facilities that are probably going to be uh, unattended, right? At that point, they'll be automated, isolated, and maybe sealed in to the point that they're physically inaccessible. So that's one aspect. But the fact of the matter is that there's not going to be any people there. So that's something that I'm still not clear as far as how they're going to provide security for these sites. But as soon as I have an answer for that, I'll be sure to share that with the rest with the audience. But that's definitely something that's caught my attention for a while. And one of the things that I mean, well, until we get something like hydrogen up and running, and until we get, for example, more battery storage that's a lot more dispatchable and more resilient to cycling, right? That's something that I think we're going to need. I remember a few months back we had a guest on from ESS Energy Storage Systems, where they had one of those iron iron-based batteries that had a nearly unlimited number of cycles, right? So that shows a lot of promise in that regard. So I'm really excited to see what they develop. But again, you can't really rely on just one or two types of sources of energy, right? Well, you want to have a diversified portfolio, at least in my opinion, anyway. So the other thing that we wish to see, of course, is places that like Hawaii. I can imagine socially, politically, that may be more of a challenge to actually implement that in those states and those islands, right? Given the fact that they're more ecologically sensitive and they're smaller, but at the same time, though, it's just the fact that the islands have a lot of geothermal energy potential. They have a couple of sites that are already uh, producing geothermal energy, and they're not even at capacity, right? Because the fact is that there's nowhere to send the power to. So that's one of a project I think that would greatly benefit from having those undersea those submarine cables connecting all the items together in a grid would be a great accomplishment, right? Just from the fact of reliability, also from meeting your carbon goals, and then ultimately, right, cost, right? Just having that, just geothermal compared to what you burn right now in Hawaii, it'd be a fraction of what your cost per kilowatt hour currently is, right? So hopefully one day, I mean, I know there's some opposition to connecting interconnecting the islands with cables, but I mean, you already have a lot of cables connecting them anyway, communications cables, quite a bit of them. So and most of the public doesn't often realize that, but so it wouldn't be much of a stretch to actually do that. But again, there's usually a lot of opposition to it, and I imagine you're going to encounter much of the same opposition in Alaska from certain groups that will probably oppose the implementation of that sort of SMR. But there's something interesting about this generation versus the last few, right? Where it's like now they seem to be a lot more open to nuclear energy. They seem to be a lot more. The idea is that they're a lot more informed, and at the same time they're understanding the importance of actually using that as a bridge to get us to that zero carbon future, right? Um, and I encourage people to do their research, right? I mean, I remember a while back watching, for example, some of the developments in nuclear energy when they pretty much stalled, right, for a while because there was not much of a market here. But at the same time, the rest of the world marches on, right? So that they have a lot of that happening, and just the fact that trying to refine uranium, is indeed by its own is a pretty expensive process. So there's also opportunities to be able to like mass produce that somewhere and send that fuel somewhere else, as long as they have the same type of safer fuel. So that's another challenge as well, right? It's not all reactors use the same type of fuel, so that its own becomes a problem, right? But from an electrical standpoint, right, for me, what I'm seeing is the fact that just the fact that you can sell energy at one fraction of the cost year round, and it's dispatchable from very low load to critical to critical, and and kind of like what they do in France right now, right, where the 80% of their portfolio runs on nuclear, but it's large nuclear units, and they dispatch them, and they respond to changes in load like any other conventional unit. Granted, they have to like come down a lot more often for refueling and maintenance. Here in the U.S., we tend to keep units running for about 18 months at a time until it's time to shut them down for a scheduled outage for refueling, right? But with these SMRs, right, they'll be running for a lot longer, uninterrupted, and then eventually they'll just swap out the actual modular unit, put a new one in, and they'll just go on after that. So pretty interesting change, right? What I see in that regard. So, but yeah, so hopefully there'll be a lot more to see, especially with the feasibility studies of the utilities in Alaska. And I will offer more information once that becomes available. So definitely having a lot of interesting developments coming up. So, and I welcome comments and discussions. Well, thank you. I think that's all the time we have for today. Hopefully we'll see you again in a couple of other weeks and have more to report. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, Please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.